Welcome to Bottle Petrichor. In this new series, we sit with experts and learn how to navigate tools and resources necessary for students and researchers in Islamic Studies. Our expert today is Dr. Hythem Sidky, the Executive Director of the International Quranic Studies Association, or IQSA, who will be talking to us about Quranic manuscripts and online resources in Quranic studies. Welcome, Doctor.
Happy to be here.
Great. Hythem is really an expert, and I wanted to have him on in earlier episodes, but things just weren't working out. So I'm very glad and happy to have him on for this incredibly important discussion that we're going to be having today. And so with that, I mean, I should probably ask actually if you could tell us a bit about yourself and your research interests.
Yeah, absolutely. So my primary interest is in the transmission of the Quran in the earliest period. And that takes the form of, two things. So one is the written transmission, so Quranic manuscripts, and the other is oral transmission, so the qira'at. So those are the two main areas of interest to me right now. I'm also very interested in questions of dating manuscripts. So again, we're going to get into a big discussion of that. That's a very important topic. And I also spent some time working on stylometry, so how we can use statistical methods to say things about the style and the authorship of the Quran.
Thank you for that. And can you tell us a bit more about yourself?
Yeah, so my interest in Quranic studies started at a relatively young age. I grew up in a Muslim household. I had memorized the Quran, and then I developed more interest, and I went on to study the 10 qira'at and acquire some ijazat. And so ijazah is this idea of like a traditional certification. And so I along with the qira'at, the 10 qira'at, I also studied some works that are related to Quranic manuscripts, like Al-Muqni'. It's by Abu Amr al-Dani. We'll talk a little bit about that work on Quranic orthography. And then, of course, what started out as just a basic kind of curiosity or interest developed into a very serious hobby, and then into something that, I dedicated a lot of my time to. And actually, it was during my time, so I did my MS and PhD at Notre Dame. It was during my time there when I actually, befriended Gabriel Reynolds, who I consider my mentor and friend, of course. And, he really kind of convinced me to, he felt that my research interests were very serious, and he kind of convinced me to start, writing papers and publishing them and presenting at academic conferences. And then, I guess the rest is history, and here I am.
Excellent, and we're glad to have you. So I guess we can go ahead and get started, but kind of before we get into the thick of things, can you tell us about some of the technical terms you'll be using throughout this episode?
Yeah, absolutely. So I might, skip over a few things, so we can always, bring them up later on. But, one important thing to understand is this concept of rasm. And so rasm, it's the Arabic word for basically like the skeletal text of the Mus'haf, of the Quran. And it's distinguished from what we would call like the Quranic consonantal text, in that it's basically devoid of any dotting. Now, this is sort of a hypothetical thing, because as we'll see later on in our discussion, the earliest manuscripts that we have, basically all the evidence points to the fact that they contain some degree of dotting. So it's never free of dots. But this concept of the rasm is very important because it sort of dictates what constitutes a part of the Uthmanic text tradition. So that's the idea of rasm. Now, I mentioned orthography, and orthography is basically sort of the spelling of words. How are things spelled, and how does spelling change over time? Another important thing is paleography. So it's the study of letter shapes. So the way people write things, especially with something like the Quran, which is very calligraphic, and it basically is an art form, they change over time as well, and that aids us in being able to date a manuscript. Other important things to know, qira'at. So I mentioned that earlier. That has to do with the reading traditions. So many people do not know. I would say many non-Muslims and even practicing Muslims are unaware that there are many different ways to effectively transform or render the written text of the Quran into a spoken one, right? So how do you interpret that rasm, that skeletal text? Well, it depends on who you ask. And the most dominant tradition of qira'ah out there is that of Hafs and Asim. So Hafs was a student of Asim, and there are actually 10 canonical readings, and there are many, many more outside of the canon that are documented in the literary works and in early manuscripts. I guess we'll talk a little bit about radiocarbon dating. We can kind of cover those things as we get to them. But I think that covers the basics, and we'll go from there.
All right, great. Can you tell us something about the writing of Quranic manuscripts? What material were they written on? Who wrote them? And how were these individuals?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say, so we don't know who wrote them. So the earliest manuscripts were not autographed, the ones that we have. And so there are a couple different ways that usually a manuscript is autographed, and it usually involves someone signing their name at the very end or the very beginning of a manuscript. And unfortunately for us, those sort of the outer pages are the ones that are most likely to be damaged and lost to time compared to the interior ones. And as it so happens, more or less, none of the earliest manuscripts we have contain any sort of dating or waqf. So waqf is another way to date a manuscript, or at least sort of the latest possible date for the manuscript, and that's basically a dedication that one would dedicate a mushaf to a mosque, for example, for public use, and that would contain maybe the name of the person who dedicated it and the date. And we sometimes get in early manuscripts waqfs, but they're very, very obviously very late. So they don't really give us much, assist us in dating a manuscript. All the early manuscripts we have, the earliest ones, are written on parchment. So parchment is basically processed animal skin. Now, fortunately for us, it does enable us to radiocarbon date them, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. I do think there are a few exceptions. So there is sort of one early manuscript that's written on papyrus. There might be more. I'm not really very well informed about what is written on papyrus. Now, the other important thing is the form. So sort of the form of the mushaf of the Quran early on is that of a codex. So a codex, as opposed to, for example, a scroll. So a codex is essentially a pre-modern book. Right, so it's basically sheets of parchment that are stitched together into quires, and then those are put together between, let's say, two covers in the form of more or less like what we would call a book. And so the format is also a very important aspect, and we can look at how the quires and how the folios are arranged, and that can tell us something about the tradition, sort of in the broader sense of things within the late antique, about what traditions were utilized and available to people producing the Qur'ans. Now, I did say that we don't really know specifically, like individually, names of people who wrote mushafs or people who wrote the specific manuscripts, but we do have reports. So, for example, in works of fiqh or jurisprudence, there are discussions about, is it acceptable, or what do you do in the case of a Christian scribe copying a mushaf? And so what that tells us, and in fact, there are a number of reports that indicate to us that Christians did participate in copying down of Quranic manuscripts in that practice. So we do have little details like that as well.
Excellent. And what percentage of the Quran do we have in manuscript form?
Yeah, so I don't think we have an exact number on this. The closest thing we have is there's a website called Islamic Awareness that has aggregated basically all the manuscripts that are highly likely to basically be first century Hijri manuscripts. And they've sort of quantified how much of the Quran is present in them. And I think last I checked, their number was like 96% or something close to that. Though I will say a few things. I think that list is outdated. It hasn't been updated. And so, for example, so this is one of the amazing things about Quranic manuscripts, and even with the whole, Birmingham fragment thing, which we may choose to discuss, is that we sort of discover is a bad word, but we become more aware of early first century manuscripts as time goes on. And just recently, for example, there's this manuscript called Sarai Medina M1 or 1A that we long suspected it was photographed by Bergstrasser early on in the last century, and then what we discovered was that we suspected that this manuscript had more pages. I think it started from sort of 6, give or take. I don't remember exactly now, but we suspected that there were more folios that were not photographed. And just recently, Dr. Tayyar Altıkolag, so he's a Turkish Quranic scholar, and he had access to the manuscript, so he photographed it anew. And it actually turns out that we basically have this manuscript from cover to cover, more or less. Maybe like 1 or 2 folios are missing or they're restored. And it's a first century manuscript. It has many different scripts. It has the Hijazi script, it has the Umayyad script, it has Kufic B1A script. And so that is an example of our knowledge of how much of the Quran is present sort of from, let's say, the first century, and how that kind of changes over time. But suffice to say that more or less the entirety of the text, I would say, is more or less attested within the 1st century of Islam.
Understood. Now we should probably move on a bit to the resources. What are the main manuscript libraries that have important Quranic manuscripts, and what resources are available for students and researchers to access and navigate these manuscripts?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of, and I'll share my screen in a little bit and go through a few of the resources. So there are different places to go. So one important thing to realize is that oftentimes a single codex, so a single mushaf, will have folios that are sort of scattered across different libraries or museums. And so one important step involved in studying a manuscript by a student or researcher is to sort of aggregate all of the folios belonging to the same manuscript together so they can study as many of those folios as possible. The place that I think does the best job at doing this, it's not exhaustive, but it is fairly comprehensive when it comes to early manuscripts, is actually Islamic Awareness. So it's not an academic resource, but it's the best that we've got. So I'm going to share my screen here and show you what that looks like. Okay, so I'm on the Islamic Awareness website, and you can see here they have a list, 1st century Hijrah, so very early manuscripts. And I'll pick a manuscript that I know is, okay, so Arab 331. So this is a manuscript that actually radiocarbon dated. It's beautiful, B1A script. And if you look down here, so they have the actually size and folios. So they actually say the manuscript has 88 folios. 56 of them are at BNF, so in Paris. This is a very important library, which I'll get to momentarily. 26 are Marcel III in the National Library of Russia. 2 are at Leiden, 2 are at Chicago, and then 1 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and 1 was auctioned. And so this sort of gives you a nice summary, and then they tell you approximately, let's say 28.5% of the text of the Quran is attested, between the different folios. So with this knowledge in hand, how would we go about looking them up and trying to study them? So the first thing I would say, so for Arab 331, it's very fortunate in that BNF, so the National Library in Paris, what they've done is they've more or less digitized their entire collection. Or at least sort of the earliest ones at least are all digitized. And so what you can do is you can actually go to their website. It's Gallica. Their website is Gallica. So I have it here, gallica.bnf.fr. And you can search. So I will go ahead and search, Arab 331. And they have high quality, pictures of all of their manuscripts. So the search came up. You're going to get a lot of things here, but the key thing you're looking for is Quran. And we don't see it here, so let's go ahead and do that. And sometimes their website can be a little bit slow. And let's see if we do any better this time. Aha, here we go. It just says, so it's a little tricky. You kind of have to get used to navigating the website, but oops, I can tell you that's it right here. And if I go ahead, select the folio 1R, you can see it right here. So there's this manuscript. Now, there is another resource. So then, if you want to look up Marcel III, you'd have to go to the National Library of Russia website. But there is an alternative. The alternative is actually Corpus Coranicum. So Corpus Coranicum it's a project out of Germany. And what they've done a wonderful job, is they've gone through and they have documented the contents of dozens and dozens of Quranic manuscripts. And recorded exactly what verses are present and entered them into their database. And in some cases, they do offer transliterations, although I will say the transliterations are, let's say, a work in progress, so there could be some mistakes in them. But what you can do is you can pick, the chapter, the surah, and verse that you're interested in and look it up there, or you can navigate based on manuscript. Now, of course, based on the surah and based on the verse you're looking at, it's going to restrict what manuscripts you can see. But if you want to view all of them, you can kind of go to their manuscript section. I think you have to go back to their home. And then you can go here. And then here you can see the different libraries or museums that they have and the manuscripts that are associated with them. So for example, let's say Yeah, like the Vatican, for example, you can see all the manuscripts that have been entered into their database from the Vatican. You can click them right here, and it'll take you to them. Or you can go by surah and verse, and that'll take you to all the manuscripts that have that particular surah and verse. Now, in some cases, they don't have licensing available for the images. So if I go to a different folio, this is DAM 29.1. So if I go to a different folio, you might get a licensing error. Nope, this is available. So we are lucky here. Let me try a different one. It might be that they were able to make it all available. I don't know. It's been a little while since I've looked at this one manuscript. Yep, so it's here, and then there's a transcription. But I can tell you, for example, the Marcel folios are not available. So let's go to Marcel 3. That was the one that we were just looking at. And if we click it, we can see here that unfortunately we do not have permission to display an image of this document, but you do get a transcript. So your mileage may vary, but Corpus Chronicum, I would say, is a indispensable resource for anyone who's sort of seriously interested in studying Quranic manuscripts. Of course, the other, so one thing I will say is the resolution sometimes isn't great on the Corpus Chronicum website, and oftentimes going back to the original source, you'll be able to get access to much higher quality images. So here, if I go to the British Library Mushaf, BLOR 2165, you can see here, they do link to the folios in the British Library. And if I click them, I just kind of want to show you here. Let me minimize this Zoom thing, and I can click a random folio. And as I scroll, it's available in very, very high resolution on the British Library website, higher than what you're going to get on Corpus Chronicum. So it's important to be resourceful to kind of understand which libraries have made their collections available online. So we mentioned the British Library, it's available online. So Gallica from Paris, Cambridge has their folios online, and National Library of Russia, St. Petersburg has some online, though the quality isn't as good. And it's just up to the person to kind of look around. To Begin is available online to basically identify the manuscripts and the folios they're interested in.
Excellent, thank you. And can you tell us a bit more about, I guess, general resources in Quranic studies, online resources, like if you're looking for a different reading or something like this?
Yeah, sure. So let me actually go ahead and share my screen again. So I did mention, one of my interests is in the qira'at, the reading traditions. Let me try to hide the Zoom bar here. Okay. So in terms of resources for the qira'at, there's actually a very cool website called nquran.com. And if you go to Quran, you do need to know Arabic. I don't think this is available in English. And you go under Al-Qira'at Al-Qur'aniyya, so the Quranic readings. And then you can go to Muqaranat al-Ayat bir-Riwayat, and you click that. It'll take you to a page that looks like this. And what it allows you to do is navigate the entire Quran, and it will show you highlight all of the variants that are present among the 20 transmitters, canonical transmitters of the 10 canonical qira'at. So if, you can see here, it's marked in purple. Let me kind of enlarge this. Andartahum. So right here, there's a change in the sort of the rules to do with Hamza. And you can sort of see highlighted in different, they have it sort of a color system. Here you can see the meme is in blue, indicating sort of a pausal pronunciation, alayhim, andartahum, am lam tundirhum, and other variants as well present on this website. What's nice is you also get little audio clips, so you can hit the little headphones icon and select a reader. Sometimes they have multiple options, usually with the more popular readings. So if you click Qalun here, you can find 4 different reciters, and you can select something. You can click the audio icon. So I don't know if you can hear that or not, but I could. So I would say this is a wonderful resource, and I rely on it in my own work just to kind of quickly look at things. There's also a digital sort of companion for Shadi Nasr's recent book that's come out, the second canonization of the Quran. So if you go on Brill online, this is available for free. You can find here the second canonization of the Quran. So the URL is here, but if you Google it, it'll come up. If you look up his book, you can find this page. And what he's done is he does have audio clips associated with every variant, as you can see here, and he has it sort of transcribed in English, if that's helpful to anyone. Lists the transmitters, and has a few notes about the different types of variations and things like that. Whether something is usul, so it's sort of a principle that's applied throughout the entire Quran, or if it's a specific one-off variant. Now, what's different between this resource and Quran? The difference is Ibn Mujahid documents the 7 readings through transmitters that are not just the canonical ones that we sort of know from Adani and Shatibi and things like that. And so you can get that additional information by looking here. So think of this as a digital transcription or a digital version of Ibn Mujahid's Kitab al-Sab'a. He also does have a link up here to Usul. So if you're just interested in Usul, you can click that, and it can take you to all these the different Usul that are present throughout the Quran, with little audio clips that you can play and listen to. I am aware that he is working sort of on an update to this or something like that. So I guess we just have to stay tuned for sort of an updated version. So I think this is another excellent resource. I'll stop sharing my screen for just a moment to say that anyone who's sort of interested in the cutting edge of Quranic reading traditions, the qira'at, definitely has to rely on sort of traditional books, because many of the things that are in the books are not really available online at all. And really, it's a very active area of in terms of sort of editing and publishing new works. So, there's a work here, right here. This is called Jami' al-Qira'at. It's by al-Ruthbari, Abu Bakr al-Ruthbari. So he's a 5th century scholar. He's a student of Al-Ahwazi, who's a very important Quran transmitter. But this documents like over 20 qira'at that are sort of outside, of course, the canonical 10. And I would say this is a very important work. And I have, at least, there's a Kamil by Hudani, and there are many works here that basically document non-canonical readings, either in part or in whole, that are absolutely indispensable for anyone who is sort of seriously interested in studying the qira'at. They definitely do need to sort of go the old route until things like this become available digitally or in some other form.
So thank you for that. Just kind of following up with some of the things that you mentioned. First, it's probably best to ask, you mentioned usul and furush. Well, what are these?
Yes, sorry, I actually forgot to elaborate. So usul are essentially principles, systematic, more or less, they're usually linguistic principles that are applied throughout the entire Quran that belong to a specific reading tradition. So, for example, Warsh has a rule that says that a preconsonantal hamza, so hamza sakina, if you look at the root of a word and the hamza is the first consonant of the triliteral root, then in preconsonantal position, he will drop that hamza. So he would say, for example, instead of ya'kulu, he eats, he would say ya'kulu. So that's something that is applied throughout the entire Quran. Now, there are always, not always, but sometimes there are little exceptions here and there that if you really want to sort of stick to one system, you would have to be aware of. But that's the general idea of usul. So furush, on the other hand, are just sort of one-off variants. So, for example, someone might read in a specific verse, Wallahu khabirun bima ta'malun, and God is, all-knowing or aware of what you do, ta'malun, and someone else might read ya'malun, of what they do, for example. And that would sort of be on a word-by-word basis. Sometimes there are patterns you can identify that kind of repeat themselves, but that would still be called furush and not usul, because it's not necessarily linguistic. It's sort of ad hoc.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Just another follow-up. Do we have manuscripts which show different canonical readings?
Yeah, so
towards different canonical readings.
That's a great question. So there are two parts to it. Like we didn't talk about is number one, vocalized manuscripts. So how did people, prior to sort of the Quran with all the vowel system that we know, indicate a reading in a manuscript? And so there's a system for vocalization. And the other thing is, are there manuscripts with canonical readings? So to answer the second question first, I would say like in the first maybe 2-3 centuries, you'd be hard pressed to find a single manuscript that actually conforms exactly to one of the 10 canonical readings as we have them. The only exception to that, I would say, is potentially Abu Amr, And maybe so, like maybe the first 2 centuries, I would say I don't know of any manuscript that has that documents one of the 10 canonical readings. Maybe in the 3rd century, you start seeing Abu Amr, Hamza, and Warsh, or Nafi', let's just say broadly speaking, they do show up. But the others are basically very rare. It's very rare to find them. And you know, essentially, if you start looking at the early manuscripts, and this is a very interesting area of research, there are dozens and dozens of different reading traditions that are documented in these manuscripts where no 2 are exactly alike. And we have no idea who these readings belong to. So that's a very, very interesting area of research. Now, what I will do is I will share my screen, and I will say one thing. So it does sort of give additional context to this narrative that Ibn Mujahid felt that the proliferation or the explosion of different reading traditions, you know, it got sort of too far, and it sort of, he wanted to rein it in. Now, I will say it is just because there are, you know, dozens of different reading traditions, it doesn't mean that, you know, every single word has, you know, a dozen different ways of reading it. It seems that, or the best way I can describe it is there are different pools of variants from which people draw. So there's kind of like this, they're cycling through the same variants. It's just that the order, their choice of combination of combining these variants differ from one manuscript, from one reader to the other. That's not to say manuscripts don't contain readings that are not part of the 10 or whatever. They absolutely do. But I would say the overwhelming majority of variants you see kind of fall within that range. It's just the choices, the specific combinations are unique. So with that said, let me go ahead and share my screen. And what I have here is I have a manuscript that is dotted. So this is a fairly late manuscript. But what I wanted to highlight are these colored dots that are on the folio here. So what we can see, so let me kind of double click to zoom in a little bit. We can see, you know, the red color. So red indicates the primary reading present in a manuscript. And, you know, generally speaking, there are 3 basic rules to remember, and then things get they can get super complicated, but a dot above a letter is a fatha. So this is men as opposed to min. And then a dot in front of a letter, usually on the baseline, is a dhamma. So this is lahu. So you can see this dot is sort of up high. So, and this is a lam, so lahu. And then a dot underneath a letter is a kasra. So I'm kind of looking for this. Yes, right here. So this is ilma. And then here we have tanween, which is indicated by these double dots. So these dots right here, they're up high on the alif. So it's tanween. Obviously, there's the alif for the accusative, but it's ilman. And that's what you get in the manuscript. Now, there are a few other features. So in this particular manuscript, you can see the green color right here. And the green color, it seems, is used to mark hamza. So this is men adhina. And the hamza right here is marked in green. And sometimes what you'll find is manuscripts will put this, you know, the dot to the left of the alif if there's a long alif that's intended. So if it was adina, the dot would be, which doesn't make any sense, but it would sort of be on the left-hand side. And here we have aidihim. You get the dot again for the hamza. Now, there are a couple other markings. So here yellow is used to mark. Now, this is actually a good question. Is this marking a different reading or is it specifically just marking other variants? Well, if we look at this yellow dot, it's after the meme. And we see here, ya'lamu ma bayna. So this dot is marking the dhamma, ya'lamu ma bayna, which would suggest, and this is me looking at this folio for the first time, so you know I would have to think about this in more detail, but it could imply that the default reading without the yellow mark is with idgham, ya'lam ma bayna. So this is a feature of Abu Amr's reading, which would be called idgham al-kabir or major assimilation. So this would be ya'lam ma bayna. And we see here aidihim, and then so there are a couple marks, blue here after the meme. So that would indicate aidihimu. And then we have the yellow mark sort of after the ha. This would be a dhamma. So it could be aidihum. And then the red, of course, marking aidihim. But the question is, does the blue dot correspond with the yellow does it correspond with the read, or is it a separate reading in and of itself? So does that, so the question is aydihumu a reading, or aydihimu, or aydihum, or aydihim? Like, which of these are indicated? You don't know without sort of going through the manuscript. More of the folio is to try to extract what specific system is at play here, and sometimes you can't know. But those are some of the markings that are present in a manuscript that indicate how one goes about reading them. Now, I will say a wonderful resource for how to read vocalized manuscripts is actually another book by Abu Amr al-Dani, and this is kind of the go-to book. It's called Al-Muhkam. So في علم نقد المصاحف. So I highly recommend this work to anyone who is genuinely interested in vocalization. There are some papers that sort of compare Al-Muhkam with manuscripts. Yassine Dutton, George as well published one, and a few other folks I may not remember also kind of compared, but I think a more thorough analysis and comparison of Al-Muhkam and other works that do mention naqd. I think Al-Kirmani has a work on naqd, and Al-Jassas, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, there are other scholars who have works on dotting, and they contain very interesting statements and quotes about how manuscripts are vocalized and the intention behind them and things like that. And so I think those are very important works for folks who are interested in this area of study. All right, so what I'll do now is actually I'll go back and share my screen because there are a few things in manuscripts, other markings that we didn't talk about yet. So let me go ahead, share my screen here. So this is a relatively late manuscript, but what I wanted to do is kind of highlight something in a fairly old one. So this is MS ADD 1125 in Cambridge. It's a Hijazi manuscript, and you can see there is vocalization. So, and the question is this vocalization contemporary with the text or not? And there are indications that it's not. Excuse me, but we can kind of discuss that, whenever you like. But the things I wanted to point out are verse separators. So if you look here, there are these sort of 4 oblique dashes that are present here to indicate a verse separator. The color is consistent with the primary, ink used to write the text. So you could say that it's contemporary. You also get decoration here. So this is actually a verse separator. So you have an iqab, and then you get sort of this decoration here, which is just a flourish, but it is a verse separator. But you do get something interesting, which is that every 10th verse, you get this red marking. And if you look very closely, you can see traces of the same dashes underneath it. So it looks like it was erased. So this actually is the letter ha, the Arabic letter ha, and this is part of sort of the Arabic numeral counting system. And this is this letter ha corresponds to 5, and so this marks every 5th verse. But then, of course, between so every 5th in the sense that 5, 15, 25, etc. Because every 10th verse or every 10 is actually marked by this decoration right here, and it's a red circle with this sort of a series of dots around it, and you can see the ink kind of looks a little bit different from this. So this also was probably added in by the same person who added in the ha that we looked at earlier. And these are used to indicate the verse counts in a manuscript. So in the same way we have reading traditions, we do also have verse counting traditions. So where do verses end and other ones begin? There is actually a disagreement, and there are regional traditions associated with verse counts. So we have 2 systems out of Medina that are more or less identical with a small difference. We have one out of Mecca, we have Basra, we have Kufa, we have a Damascene system, and we have a Himsi system. And sort of the work that, as a resource, the work that one would rely on to kind of compare their manuscript against those systems would be Spitaler's work. And what he did is he went through something like another one of Ad-Dani's books, which is called Al-Bayan fi Addi al-Quran. And he basically extracted and summarized in a table that you can see here. If I go a little bit further, you can see here he's kind of highlighted all the verses where there are disagreements. I think my Acrobat is kind of twitching out here. There you go. So he's kind of marked, and he has a key. You can kind of look up what each of these symbols stands for, and he has sort of marked all the verses where there are disagreements. Now, in the same way I mentioned that there are many non-canonical readings that are present in manuscripts, there are also non-canonical verse counting systems that are present in manuscripts. And sometimes you can say, well, this isn't exactly, you know, the Kufan system or the Kufan count, but it's very, very close to it. You can do the same with reading traditions. I'm sorry, I worded that backwards. In the same way, you can look at a manuscript and the vocalization, you can say, well, this reading is probably, you know, Medinan, even though it's not exactly Nafi' or Abu Ja'far or any of the Medinans we know. You can do the same thing with the verse counting systems. I will say he includes the Himsi counting system in here, which he did not get from Al-Bayan, which doesn't document it fully. He got it from, I think, Al-Hamadani. Don't quote me on this, but it's the Mubhijul Asrar, I think is the name of the work. And it emphasizes, or it sort of does a good job of documenting the Himsi system, which essentially went extinct at some point in time. So that's sort of how you would go about studying the verse counts in a manuscript. You would rely on something like Spitaler. There is one thing to mention, actually, is that in recent years, and even like in recent months, new works to do with verse counting have been published. So, and the early ones. So Adani, he's a 5th century scholar. We have the work of Ibn al-Munadi, which just got published, I think, by Markaz Malik Faisal. And we do have the work of Ibn Shadan as well, which was just published recently. So there are early, I think Ibn Shadan, a 3rd century scholar. So there are works that are basically being edited and released that do document more of the variation that was present in the verse counting systems. And anyone, again, who is very serious about studying verse counting should definitely acquire those works and utilize them in their research, if they're interested sort of in comparative analysis, at least.
Excellent, thank you. And I mean, I do want to talk about the various scripts you might see in manuscripts, but before that, since we're already talking about it, can you just generally tell us about some of the important resources students should be familiar with when trying to navigate Quranic manuscripts and stuff like this? And I guess more broadly, and perhaps you can answer this later as well, but what statistical tools and quantitative methods do we have in this field, and how are they applied to Quranic studies?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, there are sort of 2 aspects to studying manuscripts. So one is understanding how to read them and what features to look at. So I did highlight vocalization. I did highlight, well, I didn't really talk about orthography, but, you know, the Quranic orthography or spelling changed over time, generally speaking, in the direction of sort of being more explicit about writing medial alifs and other things like that. And one can use Quranic orthography to understand things like the date of a manuscript, to understand something about the milieu in which that manuscript was written, the time period, the people, and also the region potentially in which that manuscript was produced. And if one is interested in doing sort of comparative work, then, you know, I didn't mention, so I think this is a good point to mention. Adani has 3 main works that, you know, they're kind of like a holy trinity here. And, you know, one of them is Al-Muqna', which deals with Quranic orthography, so the spelling of words in the Quran. And then he has Al-Muhkam, which deals with Quranic vocalization, so the whole colored dots that we talked about. And then he has Al-Bayan, which deals with verse counting systems. And so I think these are 3 core works that summarize what was available to Adani and many early scholars before him, kind of condensed in the book. So I would say those are very important resources if you're interested in understanding. So how, you know, what does sort of the received literary tradition say, and sort of how does it portray Quranic manuscripts? And you want to compare that with what we actually find in the material evidence, so in the manuscripts themselves. Now, when it comes to manuscripts, of course, themselves and sort of more modern studies, you know, on you know, when it comes to Quranic paleography, Francois de Roche is sort of you know, umda, as they would say. He's, you know, he's really a go-to guy on Quranic paleography, and he did publish. So let me share my screen here, at risk of wandering down a rabbit hole. So he has this 1983 catalog where he went through the collection in Bayanaf, and he basically sort of came up with his script style classification system here. So he has, you know, he has the Hijazi, which he's sort of split up into 4 categories. And then he has, you know, A, B, C, D, E, and then he has new style and things that he couldn't classify. So of course, it's a useful exercise to go through, because we'll talk about dating, but to sort of identify the script style in which a manuscript was written. So that's an important piece. The other aspect, of course, is, The other aspect, of course, is sort of the materiality of a manuscript. So there's codicology, and I have his book here. So this is Islamic Codicology, and it's published by Al-Furqan Islamic Heritage Foundation. And I found this to be a very useful book. So it talks about, how choirs are structured in manuscripts, and, the Gregory rule, and how many sheets of parchment are in a choir, all kinds of things like that, how manuscripts are ruled. So I think that this is, I keep saying this, but it's really an industry. And he actually talks a little bit more about, the art, the decoration of, some of the paneling decoration and things like that. So this is a wonderful resource, a great book. I rely on it all the time. We also have, so I'm trying to think about Quranic orthography. I really think that one should, generally speaking, go through Deroche's works. I think they're very, very useful. You also have, when it comes to paleography, so actually let me share my screen again here. So there's a book called The Abbasid Tradition. It is out of print, but there is sort of a PDF floating around. It is by Deroche as well, but what he does here is it's sort of very visual. He does go through and describe in great detail what distinguishes the different scripts in terms of letter shapes. And so he has sort of descriptions in words, but he also has these beautiful tables, these sort of letter charts. And he shows, for example, the A1, B1A, B1B, and B2, like how the alif shape changes, and how, the jim and ta and all these things change, and with little descriptions here. And I think this is very useful to help, someone develop a degree of intuition and an eye for identifying scripts. I'll also mention Alain's, George's work here. This still is in print, and I do have a paper copy or a physical copy. I recommend people buy it, but this helped me out a lot when I was starting out. So at the very end, at the very end here, he actually has an appendix, and it's a guide to Deroche's script classification. And what he does here is he puts these little rectangles around the different letters, and he emphasizes what you should look at. Like, if you want to train your eye to pick up on things quickly and learn the script styles, I highly recommend this as a resource. It helped me out a lot. I would say to scan this PDF is actually terrible. But if you get it, I actually don't know where my copy is now. But I recommend you do purchase the volume, and it will be very, very helpful. So those are some of the resources I personally rely on. We covered paleography, we covered orthography. You have works like Adani, and then orthography is really scattered throughout many other works on Rasm al-Masahif. We covered so verse numbering. I mentioned Spitaler's paper, and I mentioned Adani's work and other works. I would say keep up with publications. I think so. So one of the things is that's important to highlight is Deroche kind of laid out his system in 1983. He did update it and sort of created some new classes like the Umayyad style, like the O1 and that kind of grouping. But that he, generally speaking, relied on the manuscripts that were available to him in Paris to come up with his classification system. And he did have a category of unclassified manuscripts that didn't fit neatly into any of his categories. But some of these unclassified styles, as more manuscripts sort of pop up, either in auctions or in digitized collections online, where people are starting to be able to put together new script styles that don't quite fit into any of those, but they're not like a one-off manuscript, they're very clearly a distinct style. And also some of the categories that Deroche came up with, he only relied on a single manuscript or to come up with that classification. So there's a lot more work that's needed. For example, one of the students, Eleanor Salah, she does wonderful work on paleography and codicology. And so she's refined his system a little bit. So I think anyone who's very interested in being on the cutting edge, I mean, it seems like it's an obvious thing to say, should really kind of keep up with the literature on these kinds of things.
So thank you so much for that. Can you tell us a bit about the statistical tools and other quantitative methods we have that and how they're applied to the study of the Quran?
Yeah, so I myself, I maybe I didn't mention it early on, but I have a background in applied math and generally sort of computational statistics. And a lot of my work centers around combining more classical philological approaches with computational analysis. And I think what I try to do is I try to look for patterns in manuscripts and the reading traditions that sort of to the naked eye are very hard to identify, or the volume of stuff that I'm analyzing is just a little too much for sort of a human or one person to kind of sift through and analyze. So I would say there isn't any specific one resource when it comes to statistical tools. They are tools after all. And so it does require that one have a background in statistics or computational methods. And they sort of have to recognize a problem and also recognize what tools might aid them in solving that problem and then sort of bring them to the table. But there's a very common saying in sort of computer science, which is garbage in, garbage out. So if you kind of just have tools and you just throw numbers at a computer, you're going to get numbers out, but it doesn't mean that they are coherent or cogent or any of these things. And so one does need to have a background in stats, in numerical methods, and also really understand the question they're trying to answer. So I think this area now is called the digital humanities. So people are specializing in really bringing the two things together. So the humanities work, which is everything we're talking about in Quranic studies, and then the digital side of things, the computational side. I myself don't share that heritage. I'm not sort of a digital humanist by training, but many of the things I do would fall under that category. Now, what specific resources are available? So I will say this is maybe a little bit of a complaint on my part, but when it comes to manuscript, so I did show Corpus Quranicum, and it does have transcriptions available, but the system, the transcription system used here is not really amenable. So it relies on these colors, right, to indicate sort of differences between the standard, 1924 Cairo edition, if you will, and the manuscript that is being presented. And that's not really amenable to easy sort of computational analysis. Also, this text isn't really downloadable. So like, for example, if I wanted to compare manuscripts, I would have to like copy paste or write some code to go and scrape the website and download this text. It's not available in a digital format that makes it easy for one to analyze with a computer. So in contrast to this, I will show you an example of, let's see, where is it? Right here. So this is an example. So this is Alba Fideli's work. And so she's really at the forefront of what I would say sort of structuring digital editions of manuscripts. So this is this is a transcript using what's called a TEI format. It's an XML file. I know I'm getting a little bit technical, but anyone who has some familiarity with this will kind of appreciate what I'm saying here. So this is a special XML file with a unique markup system that makes it very easy to take in a computer with code and analyze it and compare it with other manuscripts, and generally collate things and produce critical editions and all kinds of things like that. It also allows you to incorporate sort of inline notes that you can look up and annotations and read them digitally and things like this. So this is sort of the ideal of what one would hope sort of the field of Quranic manuscripts to move towards is the availability of things like this. And what that would do is, this is maybe somewhat a bit selfish, but it would make it easier for me to be able to take these transcriptions and use them in my analyses. Of course, when I transcribe manuscripts myself, I try to use a TEI, an XML system, but I think it's still in its infancy, and it'll take some time for it to evolve and to mature. Actually, I think is the better way to put it. That said, so how do I personally do my work now? I actually rely on Excel spreadsheets. So, what you can see here is, the spreadsheet, the main spreadsheet that I use that went into my analysis of the regionality of manuscripts. And you can see I just manually went through all of these manuscripts and I transcribed the words there. And I had my own coloring system to note things and my own annotations and things like that. But this is what I had to do. And then I was able to take this spreadsheet and import it digitally and do my analysis. But until sort of more, until something like Corpus Quranicum is available, more readily in a digital format, that's generally speaking the way I go about my research. Is it's very laborious in the beginning. You have to mainly go through and transcribe things, and then you get the computational side of things. However, one other thing to note, that if someone is interested in stylometry and studying Quranic syntax and things like that, there is corpus.quran.com. So this website contains the University of Leeds corpus. So what they've done here, so if I look at their syntactic tree bank, so they've gone through, not for the entire Quran, but up until, you can see here till Surah 8, and then from 59 to the end. You have this wonderful interactive website that takes you through Quranic, syntax and morphology. And you can also download, it's a non-interactive version of sort of the tagged corpus. So if you go into resources and data download, you can give your email and then or name or whatever, and you can download their corpus, and that one you can kind of work with digitally pretty easily. Now, if you're not really a good programmer, but you kind of do want to search the Leeds corpus in a way, then I do recommend the Quran Gateway project. So it's a wonderful, wonderful website. And what they do have is they sort of have the whole corpus. You can kind of browse, they have their own unique sort of search language, I guess I can call it. So let me kind of go back home, and you can see here, you can enter commands, you can look at all the roots in the Quran, and then you can search by, by lemma, by root. So if I say, root, and I go, I don't know, maraja, and you search, you can see here, it brings up all the verses that contain the root maraja, and you can kind of hover over it. You can look for glosses, exact inflections, all kinds of things like that. I think it's a wonderful resource for someone who doesn't know how to program, but wants to sort of ask more complex questions of the Quran, or search for very specific things. They can use their little search engine. It also has sort of a list of Quranic formulae, which is really, really cool. And you can look up what surahs they belong in by root and things like that. And you can generate nice graphs. So I do recommend Quran Gateway, even though I do most of my work by writing my own code. If anyone's curious, mostly in Python. I do rely on Quran Gateway sometimes for quick searches, and their visualizations I think are they're very handy. So those are basically the digital resources I would highlight. Oh, there's one more thing. I do recommend, if anyone's interested in digital humanities applied to Quranic studies and more broadly Islamic studies, there is the IDHN, the Islamicate Digital Humanities Network. It's a relatively new organization, but basically it's a group of like-minded individuals who are very interested in Islamic studies and digital humanities. So I recommend you sign up, join the group, or check them out. That's all.
Thank you for that. Before we move on to kind of talking about the regionality of codices and stuff like this, could you just tell us about the various scripts we see in the Quranic manuscripts, and maybe from there you could kind of move into how we date manuscripts, and on that note, and I'll probably follow up at some point, but if you could also talk about technical and methodological issues with various dating styles and which ones you prefer.
Yeah, sure. So I think it does make sense for me to share my screen here. Let me go ahead and do that. All right, so I guess the manuscript you're looking at here is in the Hijazi script. So I should before I go there, I should mention that generally speaking, the sort of most dominant script style classification system is the one I mentioned earlier that is mentioned or described here in de Roche's 1983 catalog. So he kind of categorizes manuscripts or script styles into the Hijazi script, and he sort of has a subclassification of Hijazi, which we'll look at in a little bit. And then he has the A1 script, and he has B, C, and then later scripts like the D script and E and New Style and things like that. You might not look at all of them, but I will sort of show some of the characteristic script styles. So now when it comes to the Hijazi script, one of the characteristic things about Hijazi is the fact that, the alif is leaning over to the right. And this manuscript here, this is the Cambridge manuscript I showed earlier. So this would be Hijazi 1, the Hijazi 1 script. And if one were to compare this to something like, the British Library manuscript, this would be Hijazi 2. You can see, distinct differences in the script style between the two of them, even though they're both generally still Hijazi. the shape of the ha a little bit, the shape of the noon, the tail of the alif is different as well, but they're both considered Hijazi script. Now from there, you kind of can go in a couple different directions. You can go in the direction of the A script style, or like A1. And I don't have a manuscript to show here, but what I can do is I can go to Alan's book here, and he highlights the A1 script, and you'll see he circled some key letters because there's sort of a divergence between the A script and the B script, and we can highlight the two of those. So you can see here, he notes that the alif for the A1 script is, short to medium sized and a relatively flat return. So that little tail on the alif. The other thing is what I want to draw your eye to. I'm not going to hit every feature, but is the ha. So if you look at the ha, the best way for me to describe it is it kind of looks like the word initial ha that we write today, like in modern times, the ha here. And this is how it looks like, whether or not it's in the beginning of a word or in the middle of a word. It kind of looks like that. When you compare that to the B script style, even though they may be contemporaneous, the B script style looks different. The ha looks different. So let me pull up something in the B script style right here. So this is Wettstein 1913. It has been retouched a little bit, but notice how the ha, it's kind of like that figure 8 type shape. It has like a loop above the baseline and a loop below the baseline. And it's the same whether or not it's in the middle of a word or at the beginning, right? So ahlaknaha right here and masakinahum, and you can see it right here as well. The ha. So that's sort of a distinct thing. There's still the tail of the alif, there's still the shape of the noon, other features like that distinguish the B script from the A script, but that's kind of what you're seeing, what you're going to see. Now this is B1A in the sense that the alifs still do lean a little bit, so they're somewhat Hijazi in the sense that they do lean. And then you have B1B, which is sort of a little bit later from B1A. Let's see if George has an example of that in his book. He should. So if I scroll down here, you can see right here. So this is B1B, right? And so you can see these alifs are sort of perfectly vertical. It's a very sort of slender script style, and the has, they're the same shape ha that you basically get in B1A, and you're going to get the same in actually B2. So B2 is right on the right hand side here. It's a little bit more developed, a little bit more regular. There are also differences typically in the format, the actual format of the manuscript itself. That's often associated with a script style. So for example, the B2, I don't know of any B2 manuscript that's actually vertical. So you can see this is horizontal, kind of it's landscape, while this is portrait, or this is actually more square. But the B1A manuscripts, I was showing you, and I think more or less all of them are portrait as well. So you can you can kind of see here, it's like this, it's portrait, while the B2 manuscripts tend to be landscape. And what you can also see from sort of the shift from Hijazi all the way to sort of like, let's say B2, is that B2 is highly regular. So you can see it's almost like it's written on a grid. And in fact, it may well be. It's very, very regular. Whereas the Hijazi manuscripts, like let me go back to here, it looks a little sloppier. It's not as geometric. In fact, you can see sometimes there is ruling. So these people did sort of rule before they wrote, but they still are a little bit sloppier, less regular, less geometric than later script styles. Then we have sort of the C style. So here, this is the Topkapi, the famous Topkapi manuscript that's falsely attributed to Uthman. So this is the C style or C1 manuscript, and here you can see the ha. It's more developed, it's more evolved compared to the A style, but it is still that triangular shape as opposed to the double 8 shape that you get. And there are also different features you can see with the shape of the noon and also the qaf, the jim. Basically, there are many characteristic features of these manuscripts, but also another thing I wanted to highlight is that it's very tempting. And then of course I don't want to forget our D style manuscript. So I think I had it open here somewhere right here. So this is a classic sort of D style manuscript, and one can always look up for the manuscripts in the BNF collection. They can look up in de Roche's catalog the script style, and that will kind of help them develop a feel for them. So that would basically hopefully be somewhat of a summary of the script styles, and we can talk a little bit more about their dates later.
Thank you. And yeah, we probably can tackle that now. So how do we determine the age of a Quranic manuscript? And can you tell us about various issues associated with these different dating styles, and which ones you think are the most accurate?
Yeah, so this actually brings up a very important and controversial aspect of manuscript studies, which is dating manuscripts. So most, if not, the overwhelming majority of the earliest manuscripts are not dated, in the sense that we don't really have, if they ever were dated, in the sense that we don't have the scribe leaving us a note telling us when they finished copying a manuscript. If they were present, they were probably present, that sort of thing would be present in the last page or the first page of a manuscript, which tend to be lost. And so we have to rely on other sort of indicators to be able to assign a date to a manuscript. And there are two buckets I would sort of put things in. One is relative dating. The other one is absolute dating. Relative dating relies on things like paleography, so things we just talked about, so the change of letter shapes. Relies on orthography, so how words are spelled over time. It can also rely on sort of art historical things. So some manuscripts might have like a nice drawing or certain illuminations that some scholars might link to, let's say, Umayyad architecture, and they might use that to date things. But those are sort of the general. I guess that would constitute maybe some form of absolute dating. So I would put that in the second category. But in terms of relative dating, the primary tools available to us tend to rely on paleography and orthography. Now, how does one go about dating something paleographically? I think there are a number of challenges with that. So it all depends on how precise and how accurate you want to be. So if you want to say, so when you do relative dating, you say, well, this manuscript A is older than manuscript B. But sometimes that's not really enough, right? So there are some very high stakes questions that have to do with, like, well, was this manuscript written, within a 50-year window or a 25-year window or things like that? And it becomes very difficult, not impossible, but it does become difficult to use paleography to make a determination like that. And the reason is, the evolution of paleography is not linear, right? So it doesn't march perfectly from Hijazi to A to B to C, etc. It's not what happens. You sometimes have different script styles that are present in different regions, and you don't necessarily know about that. You also have, people also have memories, right? So they may recollect older letter shapes, and you don't really know how long a style existed for before it sort of went extinct. And yes, absolutely. I would, everyone I think would be comfortable saying Hijazi is generally older than, B2. But did Hijazi and B1A coexist? I mean, I think it's certainly possible. I think they did. I don't necessarily think, perhaps, just B1A is a more structured and more sort of calligraphic style, but and Hijazi might have an older history, but by the time they manifest in Quranic manuscripts, they could be contemporaneous, right? So there are questions like that we don't know that affects our ability to date things very precisely with paleography. Orthography suffers, some of the same problems in that, orthography, you can look at general trends. You can say this manuscript uses medial aleph more frequently than this other manuscript, but it's very hard. And so you can use a number of these indicators to make a determination about the date of a manuscript, but it's very hard to be very precise about something using orthography, because again, there are manuscripts that are paleographically much later that do use sort of more defective spelling and contain more archaic orthographic features. So those are really some of the main challenges that are associated with using, paleography and orthography to date a manuscript, and that it can give you a general idea. But if you want to sort of put your foot down on very high stakes questions, it becomes very challenging to do so. Now, there might be other, individuals out there who are, there certainly are other individuals out there who are better at paleography than myself. And, the field is ever evolving, and perhaps at some point in time, we can say more definite things about manuscript dates based on paleography, but I think that gain in our knowledge is not going to come through just the study of paleography, but it actually has to do with radiocarbon dating, which brings us into the second category, which is absolute dating. So radiocarbon dating is an analytical technique that relies on the fact that carbon, so the element carbon, actually has multiple isotopes. So this stable isotope is carbon-12. I'm sorry if I'm getting a little bit nerdy here, but we also have carbon-13, which is also a stable isotope. And then we have carbon-14, which is why it's often called carbon-14 dating. So carbon-14 is unstable in that it's radioactive, but it is present in the environment around us. And and as we eat, so if it's present in the environment, that means as plants grow, it gets taken up into plants, and that any organic matter is going to contain some amount of carbon-14, the radioactive form of the unstable form of carbon. And when I eat vegetables, I take in some of that carbon-14, and of course, as I interact with the environment. But what happens is when I die, I stop interacting with the environment. And so I stop replenishing the carbon-14 that makes up this, my skin, my bone, all the organic matter in my body. And what people can do is they can actually take a portion of organic matter, so let's say parchment, the skin of an animal, and they can look at the ratio of carbon-12, and in more recent times, they also rely on carbon-13 to carbon-14. And what you can do is, because carbon-14 is unstable, the concentration of carbon-14 drops over time, but carbon-12 remains stable. And by looking at that ratio, compared to the ratio in the environment that we know, and that requires calibration, which I'll get to in a little bit, we can date a manuscript. Now, radioactive decay is a random process. And instrumentation that people use, like the AMS instruments or other things, have a finite precision and a finite accuracy. And the combination of the fact that decay is a random process that is well described, but it's still a random process, means that the output, when you take something to have it radiocarbon dated, what you get is you get a probability distribution. You get a likelihood of the animal being sort of dying within a window of time. And the probability across that window of time is not equal. It varies based on different factors. One important factor has to do with calibration. So I mentioned that there's carbon-14 in the environment, but that concentration of carbon-14 in the environment, number one, is not homogeneous. And what that means is the amount of carbon-14 at any given moment in time in the northern hemisphere, by and large, was not the same as the southern hemisphere over time. And the general sort of science or methodology that people use to establish the concentration of carbon-14 in the environment is through dendrochronology. So it's basically looking at tree rings, which I think is really cool. So we take a cross section of a tree, they have rings, and those rings tell you the age of a tree in a very precise manner. And by taking samples from different portions of that tree, knowing the dates based on the rings of a tree, you can generate a curve of sort of, we know that at this date, this was the concentration in one portion, in the environment at this moment in time. Now, of course, these calibration curves are constructed based on samples that are drawn from many trees, predominantly across North America and Europe. And we'll get to this issue in a little bit, but that allows you to generate a calibration curve. And so when you get that ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 and 13, you can then go to the calibration curve and look up a date. And so actually the calibration curve is another source of uncertainty, right? So I mentioned the Earth is not homogeneous. And so what that means is, the concentration of radiocarbon-14 where I am right now, of carbon-14 where I am right now, is a little different than where you are, but they're very, very close. But it's still that introduces some degree of uncertainty. And all of that uncertainty of all the different avenues get combined together in giving us the probability distribution associated with the dating of a manuscript. So sometimes, instruments can be finicky. I think a good way a good analogy is a thermometer, right? So if I have an internal body temperature, but if I use a thermometer to take my temperature, I might get 98.1, and then I might just kind of reset the thermometer, take it again, just like a second later, and it might come out to be 98.2 or 97.9. And if I repeat this multiple times, I'll get a distribution, I'll get a curve, right? And that distribution, that histogram of sort of every temperature I've recorded, how many times I've recorded, it gives me the uncertainty associated with this measurement. Part of it, of course, is the thermometer, that I'm using to measure, my body temperature is, it has finite precision and finite accuracy, right? It doesn't give, it says it gives me 98.1. It doesn't give me 98.176. It doesn't give me like 50 digits. It gives me 1. Or if you're like, you buy a fancy one, it might give you 2 digits, but that limits the precision and the accuracy with which one could know their internal body temperature. Also, your body temperature fluctuates over time, right? So in the morning, it's different than when at night. If you work out, if you're out in the heat, it changes. And if I take the temperature, underneath my tongue, it's going to be a little bit different than if I take my inner ear temperature versus like an orbital temperature and things like that. So all of these, what I'm trying to really highlight is these are all factors that sort of factor into the uncertainty associated with a radiocarbon measurement. So now with that measurement in hand, so I did mention something about the northern hemisphere being different than the southern hemisphere. Now, there were a series of publications that have come out in recent years. I think they began in the mid 90s, 95 or something like that, that looked at some plants from Egypt, I think around the 16th century, give or take, that said, hey, look, it looks like the calibration curve, it looks like the dates that we get, the radiocarbon dates that we get from these plants using the calibration curve for the northern hemisphere looks a little bit different than what we know, when we know these plants were grown. And there was like a minor discrepancy in that calibration curve. And then more recently, literature has shown that when they've sampled trees and other things from like the Levant area and sort of the Eastern Mediterranean, they found minor offsets. It's called sort of a reservoir offset in the radiocarbon dates between what were found in, let's say, the Levant area compared to the what's called INTCAL. That's the standard calibration curve for the northern hemisphere. Now, some people might be like, well, we can't rely on radiocarbon dates at all because of this reason. But if you really look into it, we're talking a very, very small difference of, and it depends on what period of time, but we're talking something like a decade pre-calibration. This is a very important point. It's a decade pre-calibration, not in terms of the calendar date. So if you get a date like this, this piece of parchment was dated to 1400 before present BP. This is basically from 1950, and you get some uncertainty associated with that. That does not translate into, let me take 1950 and subtract 1400 from it, and that's the date of the manuscript. You have to sort of take it through this calibration curve. And depending on how steep the calibration curve is, it affects this offset differently. So if the curve is very flat, it can have a greater impact on the calendar date associated with a manuscript or a piece of parchment. But let me take a step back and bring this all home. We can actually do what's called a sensitivity analysis. We can look at how much does uncertainty associated with this offset affect the calendar date of a given manuscript. And I can tell you, for all the ones I have looked at, it does not make any consequential difference in the dating of a manuscript. It does not put a manuscript that we identify in one period as being in another period. So, for example, manuscripts that are very well, like let's say the Sana'a palimpsest, that we have very well dated to the first half of the 7th century, it does not all of a sudden become like post Abdul-Malik or something like that. It's still very comfortably in that period of time. So that sort of has to do with the discussion with the differences in calibration curves and things like that. So I think what I'll do next is I think I can go ahead and share my screen and show a different side of things. So how do you take an uncalibrated date and how do you convert that into a calendar date and the distribution? And of course, I mentioned that there's a calibration curve involved, and that calibration curve gets updated. So up until sort of very recently, the calibration curve that we used was called IntCal 13. So it was basically put together in 2013. And that was the calibration curve that was used all the way up until recently. IntCal 20 was published, which is the 2020 updated curve. And again, when you update the calibration curve, it does have a minor impact on the dates that you get. But what I will do is I'm going to show you the dates, the calibration of the Sana'a palimpsest using the IntCal 13 curve and using the IntCal 20. And together we can see, well, how much of a difference does the calibration curve actually have on the small changes in the calibration curve and the updates of the calibration curve have on the dating of a manuscript. So I'll go through that exercise. And then do remind me, if I don't, to discuss the issue of labs and the reliability of labs and how that plays into manuscript dating. All right, I think what I'll do now is actually I'll go ahead and share my screen and work through that example. Okay, so here I'm using the software called Oxcal. So Oxcal is published by the University of Oxford, as the name suggests. And you can see here, this is the latest version, or a very late version. You can see beginning of 2021, and this has IntCal 20. So what I'll do is I'll first open the dates for the Sanat palimpsest. So let me do that and open. And here you can see, so they do have a more sort of user-friendly interface. They also have like a scripting language, and I tend to use a scripting language, which lets me sort of configure things a little bit more precisely to my liking. But here you can see I have dates from the University of Arizona, from Oxford, and from Etihad or Zurich. And so we have 6 measurements here that are all self-consistent. And what I can do is I can go ahead. And so the first thing we're going to look at is the IntCal 13 calibration. So I'm going to run this. And so we can see here, and it's always very useful to kind of look at the very top whenever someone publishes a calibration curve. And you can see it says IntCal 13 atmospheric curve. And so what do we get? Well, we get a uncalibrated date of the combined date of 1427. And the one standard deviation of this distribution is 9 years. And then when we sort of pass it through the calibration curve, we get a sort of 2 sigma, which is 95.4% probability of between 606 and 650. So perfectly within the first half of the 7th century. Now, I think it's useful to, well, let's do the exercise of comparing the 2 dates. Then I'll talk a little bit more about how we should understand and how we should interpret the curves and how we should ask it questions, how we should query it and ask it important questions. So let's go back to Oxcal, and I'll open another instance of palimpsest here. Open. And what I will do is, let's go tools here, and I'll do that. And I'll run it. Okay, so let me put these side by side. Oops. There we go. Let me actually make them a little bit larger. Awesome. So we can see on the right-hand side here, what we have is the curve of using the IntCal 2020, so the IntCal 20, the latest calibration curve. And on the left-hand side, we have the 2013 curve. Now, if you look at the probability distribution, if you look at the 95% confidence interval, it's basically unchanged. It's still 604 to 650. But if you look very closely, what has changed is the relative probability within that interval, within that 95% confidence interval. And this brings up a very important point, which is how do you go about probing the calibration curves and sort of probing the calendar dates and asking questions of it. So one interesting question we can ask, for example, is, what is the probability that this manuscript, the animal at least, right? So this is another important question. I will get to it at the end. So we can ask the question of what is the probability of this dating from, let's say, before the death of Muhammad, which is traditionally said to be 632. So what we would do in that case is we would look at the area under the curve. All right. So we would look at the area under the curve, and you can't do it in Oxcal to the best of my ability without writing a script. But basically, you would ask, you would integrate the area under the curve, and that would give you a number between 0 and 1, and that would give you the probability of the animal having died, before 632. So that would be the kind of way you would use to determine the likelihood of that occurring. And so you can see the change in the calibration curve, this little dip here, will give you a different answer. So if I want to ask what is the probability of this dating to between 630 and 640, I'm going to get a very different answer here than I will here because of this dip that's in the middle. So that is a very important thing to keep in mind. The other thing, as I mentioned, the area under the curve is the quantity that tells us how likely something is. Because even the most likely date is very unlikely. So for example, in this curve, the peak, the highest probability date is, I don't know, like 640 something, let's say. But the actual area underneath this 1 year, if you just take a slice, like think of this as a pie, a very oddly shaped pie, but if I take a very small slice of 1 year, the likelihood of it dating from that 1 year is very, very small. So it's all about the area under the curve. And you can sort of intuitively recognize that the narrower a time span you are interested in knowing something, excuse me, the narrower the time span that you're interested in probing, the lower the probability is going to be. So that's something to keep in mind. And so that, again, to kind of bring this circle back, that's the main difference between 2013 and 2020. Notice it hasn't said, oh, this manuscript hasn't gone from, being dated, on the sort of the very tail end of 650 to being dated to, let's say, the year 700. It's just sort of tilted, the probability a little bit somewhere in the middle right here. And that's the main salient change. So of course, so now that we know now that we have a radiocarbon date, the other aspect that is involved is, okay, well, let's say just hypothetically that, there's a 632 is somewhere in the middle, and there's a, the probability of it dating before 632 is 50%, and afterwards it's 50%. This is where, we don't use radiocarbon dating in isolation. We use other other historical details or other pieces of evidence to help us determine which of those two is the more likely dating of the manuscript. And this is sort of the job of the historian, to bring other pieces of evidence to the table when it comes to identifying when a manuscript was dated. So for example, taken on its own, the date of this manuscript is consistent with a pre-death of Muhammad date, let's say. It is also consistent with a post-death of Muhammad date. Now, which of these two, and let's say the odds are essentially the same, so which of these two is more likely? Well, that you would need to sort of bring other pieces of evidence to the table, whether it's based on the contents of the palimpsest, of the document, or other things like that, to say, well, I think this is more likely, or I think that is more likely. So that's sort of the job of the historian. But it also brings up another very important question, which has to do with, well, radiocarbon dating tells us when the animal died. It doesn't tell us when the parchment was written on, which I think is a very fair point. And I think many people point out that parchment is very expensive. It was not easy to make. It's not cheap. And if you look at some of these manuscripts, the number of sheep or the number of animals that had to be slaughtered in order to make or produce that manuscript is enormous. And the thinking is that, generally speaking, the parchment would have been produced shortly after the time when the animal was slaughtered, and that parchment would have been used shortly after. It wouldn't have been stored for a very long period of time. Now that's sort of an intuitive explanation, but actually recently I have put together a statistical argument based on radiocarbon dates and other evidence for why it is extremely unlikely that the manuscripts that we have that have been radiocarbon dated were actually written on after a very long period of time from when the animal died. Now, 1 year, 2 years, not a big deal, right? So we're saying, when we're talking decades, that's when things start to shift. And I think that's actually very unlikely based on an argument that I'm hoping to be able to publish very soon. So I hope that kind of gives you a better overview of radiocarbon dating, how we use the calibration curve to produce a calendar date estimate. Hopefully some of the limitations as well. You are limited by the resolution of the instrument, by the uncertainty in the measurement. And if you want to connect, if you want to associate a particular document with a period in time, and the odds are not specifically tilted in your favor, you have to rely on external pieces of evidence. Now, with that all being said, let's talk about a couple other things, which is sort of this is my personal opinion, where do I see radiocarbon dating stands sort of when you compare it to paleography or orthography or other forms of dating. I would personally say that the single most reliable, most consistent and objective technique that we have to date a manuscript, which also happens to give us absolute dates, is radiocarbon dating. In my mind, in my opinion, paleography is not exact. People can remember old letter shapes. We do not know when specific script styles fell out of favor or when they even emerged. And the same goes with orthography. You can speak about general trends, but are you really going to sort of die on that hill by saying, well, this manuscript has one additional word that's spelled defectively compared to that other manuscript, therefore it is X many years older? And so for me, I think paleography should be revisited on the basis of radiocarbon dating and not the other way around. I will always, when radiocarbon dating is done properly, and this is not a big caveat, but it's a caveat, properly, and I'll talk about what that means, with sort of reliable, well done, properly done radiocarbon dating, I will always prioritize that over any other form of evidence that I know of so far, like other things that paleography, orthography, etc. That doesn't mean, situating that document in history requires sort of a different type of analysis, but dating that document for me should predominantly be based on the radiocarbon date. And my hope is in the future, we can revisit some of Desroches' script styles and when he dates them to. He was working with a lot less data than we have today, so it's not any fault of his own. But I think some of the script styles that were dated to later periods of time, let's say 2nd century, even 3rd century, are actually much earlier based on new radiocarbon dates that are emerging from a number of manuscripts, not just one. So that's a very important point to highlight. And I cannot emphasize it enough. For me, properly done radiocarbon dating trumps everything else. And that's how I see it. All right, so I didn't mention I wanted to discuss the issue of reliability and labs. So, and this brings us hopefully, I think, the final aspect of radiocarbon dating. Unfortunately, in Islamic studies, when some of the first radiocarbon dating measurements that came out were published, I would say in a very unfortunate manner, in the sense that there is sort of a responsibility upon a scholar who carries out radiocarbon dating to do a few things. So number one, you should document. You should always publish the lab which tested a sample. You should always publish the uncalibrated dates, because as I showed you, calibration curves change over time, and some of these measurements were published 20 years earlier. And the other thing is, you should always publish, like, there's a sample ID that's given with each sample. You should always publish that. Why? Because the instruments that were used decades ago are far less accurate and precise compared to the instruments we have today. And if you give someone the uncalibrated dates and the uncertainties, number one, as calibration curves get updated, we can update those numbers. And number two, we can understand what time period and what instrument, because labs document things very, very meticulously, carried out this measurement. So it's traceability, and with traceability comes accountability. And this also brings up the issue of labs. So number one, early measurements that were done were just kind of published in an ad hoc manner without listing all these important things that I mentioned, uncalibrated dates, the specific lab. Sometimes a lab was mentioned, but the sample number and things like that. So people should be able to inquire with a lab about a sample, like, what kind of pretreatment did you run on the sample? What kind of, what instrument did you use? All kinds of things like that for accountability and traceability. But in the same way, to go back to this idea of a thermometer analogy, in the same way, you can have thermometers that are very imprecise or very inaccurate, that just don't work well. You can have labs that are not as reliable as other labs. And I won't mention the names of any labs, but actually there's one I'll mention. So there was a lab in Kiel, Germany, and there was a published paper in the Journal of I think radiocarbon dating that documented how their lab was producing unreliable results. So this is published peer-reviewed paper amongst experts that highlighted that the measurements that were carried out in that lab were unreliable. And actually that lab ended up shutting down. And so it's very important to realize that not all labs have have similar track records. The three most reliable labs that have primarily the scholars who work on producing the calibration curves, who are on all the committees and do all that kind of stuff, they tend to come from three labs. So the first one is the University of Arizona, you have the University of Oxford, and you have Zurich. So those three labs are the most reliable labs. So measurements coming out of those labs, I give a higher sort of degree of reliability than ones coming out of other labs. And in fact, we do have data on samples that were sent to multiple labs. So the same sort of post-treated sample that was sent to multiple labs, and the labs that I mentioned, they obtained essentially statistically consistent results. And the other labs, or the other lab, I don't remember if it was one or two now, actually the result that they obtained was anomalous. In fact, they have had issues with producing sort of self-consistent results within the lab itself. Now, this was a situation years ago. Things might have changed today. But my point is, I think a lot of people in Islamic studies have sort of made up their minds about the reliability of radiocarbon dating based on early missteps that happened in the field with radiocarbon dating. Now, the other piece, of course, is the more measurements you have, the better. So again, I mentioned, I cannot emphasize this enough, that radiocarbon, decay and everything, it's a random process. And what that means, every time you take a measurement, that measurement's going to be a little bit different. All right. And so at minimum, for someone to have a good degree of confidence in a measurement, you want to have three. So you want to have a measurement repeated 3 times, ideally from different from different folios or different pieces of parchment across a manuscript, to sort of, it show, that it was all produced in the same time and things like that. And they well could be from the same animal, but the point is, you want to sort of diversify the distribution you're kind of drawing from. And when you have at least 3 measurements that are consistent, that gives you a very great degree of confidence. And you can also apply statistical tests to look for outliers and see, are the measurements self-consistent? There's a chi-square test that's done. So with the Sana palimpsest, the dating I did, we had 6 measurements across 3 labs, and they were all self-consistent, statistically internal self-consistent, which gives a great deal of confidence to the measurement that we get for the Sana palimpsest. Now, I do recommend, if someone wants to get a good idea of how a good example of how one deals with radiocarbon dating measurements, I highly recommend the paper called The Codex of a Companion by Hythem Sidky and Bergman, where I think Sidky did the analysis where he basically goes through and he takes the raw numbers from the labs, and he basically does what I talked about, which is the area under the curve. He interrogates the manuscript to say, well, what is the likelihood of it dating from this particular date? And he interrogates the area under the curve, and he sort of handles the data in the proper way that I sort of described. Now, if we have manuscripts that are dated in the manner I just described, so you have at least ideally 3, but minimum, let's say 2 or more measurements from different folios, and that are consistent, to me, that is the most reliable way we have today to date a manuscript. And what I recommend is, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. There's well, actually, I have the book right here. So there's this book. It's part of the Documenta Quranica series out of the Corpus Quranicum project. It's called Quran Quotations Preserved on Papyrus Documents, 7th through 10th centuries. So even though, and the problem of carbon dating early Qurans. So there's chapter 6 in this book by Michel Marx and Josham. So in here, what I recommend is they do discuss radiocarbon dating. They discuss calibration, some of the issues I touched on. But I think one of the most important things is they sort of have a table here that aggregates some of the datings on some of the most important early manuscripts we have. So they have the Birmingham manuscript, they have the palimpsest, and they list the different dates. And so they have a couple of different tables that contain these dates. So I do recommend people check this out for a kind of a succinct summary of the radiocarbon dates. And they do have some of the script styles listed here as well that you can kind of compare against. I will say, though, things have also, since this was published, there's still more literature on radiocarbon dating that's come out. And I know, again, it's not a very sort of mature field and area of sort of investigation in Quranic studies. But another thing I wanted to highlight is that, the folks in biblical studies kind of went through some of the very similar issues that we went through, which is, many scholars questioned the reliability of radiocarbon dating and brought up issues of contamination and this and that and all kinds of stuff. And really, and particularly, when it in connection with the Dead Sea Scrolls, and really when all the dust settled, and people can go back to literature and look up the stories and sort of kind of watch the history play out over time. When the dust settled, it turns out that the radiocarbon dating was reliable. So, and that was done, this was done decades before the dates, some of the dates that we have today, which use different instrumentation that's far more accurate and precise. So we are in much better shape today than we were back, back when the Dead Sea Scrolls were radiocarbon dated. So really everything is in our favor. But just to kind of bring the point home, a lot of people ask me about the dating of the Birmingham manuscript, right? And so the first thing, it was dated, I think, at Oxford, if I'm not mistaken. It was dated at Oxford, but only one measurement was taken. So we have one measurement that that was done for the Birmingham fragment. So for me, yes, the date, the lab is reliable, and I don't have any issues with that. But what I would say is I would not fixate on this manuscript being impossible to date from after 650. I think the tail end of the date in the 95% confidence interval was like 645 or something. I don't remember. But for me, because we only have one measurement, we don't know like where this curve is going to go. Will the next measurement be here a little bit? Will it be there a little bit? We're not actually quite sure, right? So that's where it would be very, very important to get a couple more measurements before sort of saying something absolutely definitive about how, about sort of how we situate this manuscript, within the context of the Uthmanic canonization, which people tend to say, happened around 650. I don't know that there's any evidence that it happened around 650. I tend to think that it happened earlier on in Uthman's reign because of things that have to do with Umar and whatnot. But I mean, who knows? Maybe it was 645. It's certainly possible. But so those are important things to think about. Yes, the date is very good for the Birmingham manuscript, but the other piece I want to highlight is this is a very important thing to know is the uncertainty. I know I'm not very organized, I apologize, but the uncertainty measurement we get, this is why it's important to have multiple measurements. The uncertainty measurement we get on a single measurement that comes out of a lab should be understood as the minimum, as a sort of a lower bound on the uncertainty associated with that particular document. And that has to do with the differences between sort of instrument error and whether the distribution is sort of the sample distribution, or whether the error is reflecting the population error, or whether it's reflecting instrumentation error or sample error. So the idea is the more measurements you have, the more confident you can be in the date of the document. And I point people, if they want to know what the sort of quintessential, the exemplar of a well-dated document is the Sana'a palimpsest. We have at least 6 measurements from 3 different labs, which are all consistent with one another. We have other measurements from labs that are outliers. Those measurements are statistical outliers, and they are also not even internally consistent. What I mean is some of the labs, they made a measurement for the same document twice, and they got 2 wildly different numbers. And to me, that points to the fact that the Sana'a palimpsest the date of it is very well established. And I would say that there should be no controversy in the fact that this document is from the first half of the 7th century.
Excellent, thank you for that. Kind of just following up with something that you had mentioned about the parchment itself. The parchment tells you, or the dating at least tells you when the animal died, correct? So I imagine with palimpsests, the range would be larger because the animal died and someone wrote something on it, and then maybe several years later they scrubbed it off and they wrote on it. So a vast majority of our Quran manuscripts that we do have are they palimpsests, or are they new?
Yeah, this is actually a good question. I think we kind of jumped into the idea of palimpsests without talking about it in great detail. So the overwhelming majority of Quranic manuscripts are not palimpsests. So a palimpsest is a document that's been written on at least twice, and so parchment is a lot more durable than paper. And so what happens is an ink doesn't really bind into the fibers in the same way. So what you can do is if you write on a piece of parchment, you can actually scrape off the old, the old writing, the old ink, and you can write, and maybe you might treat the document a little bit to smooth it out, and you can write on it again. So in terms of Quranic manuscripts, so there is the Sana'a palimpsest. I'll talk a little bit more about that in detail. There's the Mingana Lewis palimpsest, which Alba Fadeli has worked on, done tremendous work on. And there's also this recently published this Coptic palimpsest, which Eleanor Salah published recently in Jirsa, which has Coptic and Quranic text on the same document. So going back to the palimpsest, so what we can do is we can sort of say something about the date of the lower text. So the first writing that happened on the palimpsest, as opposed to the second writing, so the upper text. And so it's important, I guess, to mention that one of the really neat things that happens, when you scrape ink off of parchment and you write on it. So at the time when you scrape the ink off, it's sort of invisible. The parchment looks clean and you write on it. But what happens is, of course, like tiny microscopic amounts of ink still remain that sort of are invisible to the eye. But over time, that ink oxidizes and it sort of reappears. It becomes readable again over time. Of course, it's still very difficult to read, but it becomes somewhat readable. Then we can sort of take advantage of the fact that the composition of the lower ink is not identical to the composition of the upper ink, and that because the composition is different, I'm going to get a little bit nerdy. Basically, the inks actually have peak absorbance of different wavelengths of light. So what that means is, if I shine different spectra at the manuscript, the different inks are going to fluoresce with different strengths at different wavelengths of light. So to sort of, in layman's terms, what happens is, in normal light, so if I'm just kind of looking at it, the thing that stands out to my eyes is the upper text. But if I shine, UV light, actually, if I shine ultraviolet light on it, that might bring out the lower text more. Now, the upper text is still dominant because it's sort of, the ink is still there. It hasn't been scraped away, but the lower text becomes far more readable. And there are other techniques like, X-ray diffraction, things like that, which was used on one folio for the palimpsest. And it was in Hythem Sidky's publication, where you can actually basically shower the parchment, the folio with X-rays, and bring out that lower text even more, far more that you can get from just ultraviolet light. But of course, that means you have to have an accelerator. That means you have to have all kinds of equipment that's just not as portable as a multispectral light. And so that allows us to sort of decipher the lower text better using that technique. Okay.
So thank you so much for that. Can you just tell us a bit about the implications of these palimpsests?
Yeah. So specifically, I guess the most significant one in my view is the Sana palimpsest. So what we can say is, all witnesses to the Quranic text, all surviving witnesses to the Quranic text that we have today, all descend from a single text type, which is the Uthmanic text type, basically a family, right? Except for the lower text of the Sana palimpsest. So the lower text of the Sana palimpsest belongs to a separate text type. Now, what does that mean? That means that the amount of variation that we see in the text of the palimpsest, the lower text, I'm just going to call it the palimpsest, is far greater than the amount of variation we see between manuscripts that belong to one text type. And so why is that significant? Well, I think a couple of things are significant. What's significant are the things that are in common between the Uthmanic text type and between, Sidky calls it the C1 text type, the text type of an unknown companion. So there are similarities between the two text types that I think says a lot about the nature of the Quran prior to the sort of the existence of either one of these text types. But sort of in some, we see a degree of variation in the palimpsest at the level of words, at the level of certain phrases that is not really present in the Uthmanic text. And what's very fascinating is that some of these variants that are found in the palimpsest, they actually mirror some of the variants that are reported in literary sources about companion codices. So, what is a companion codex? A companion codex is essentially, we don't have any surviving companion codex, let me put it that way, but we have reports in the literature that major companions had their own codices, had their own mushafs prior to the Uthmanic project. So Ibn Mas'ud in Kufa, for example, had his own mushaf, and Ubay ibn Ka'b also had his own mushaf. And works like Fadal al-Quran and Kitab al-Masahif and many other works, what they do is they report some of the variants that were present in those masahif, in those codices, or in codices that belong to those traditions, those text types. So while the Sana'a palimpsest, the C1 text type, is not the codex of Ibn Mas'ud, is not the codex of Ubay ibn Ka'b, is not the codex of al-Miqdad, it's none of those. It's its own, it's the codex of an unknown companion, as Sadeghi and Gudarzi would put it. Yet it reflects the same degree of variation, the same types of variants that you get in the companion codices, in the literary traditions, are found in the palimpsest. And some verbatim, like identical variants that are reported to belong to companions, were also found in the palimpsest. And another observation that they make is that they say, well, despite these differences, so the codex also has a different surah order. So that's one interesting thing. We also have reports of Ubay's codex and the Ibn Mas'ud codex having different surah orders, and we find this one, it doesn't perfectly match any companion surah order that we have, but it's closest to Ubay ibn Ka'b's as far as we can tell. So what we can say is that, somewhere around, the codification of sometime around the codification of the Quranic text, surah order was not fixed. So surah order was a little bit fluid, although there are general trends like longest surah to shortest, things like that, but it was not a fixed thing. However, within each surah, the verse order was fixed. Why? Because the verse order in the palimpsest is the same as the verse order in the Uthmanic text, with very, very minor. So I think there's like one verse missing, and and it can be explained as like an eye skip, like a parablipsis or something, so a scribal error, basically. It can be ascribed to that. And I think that there's two short verses that are transposed. We sort of get similar reports that that are present in the Codex of Ibn Mas'ud. But by and large, if someone who sort of looks at the structure of a surah, oftentimes they're made up of these small pericopes that are by and large quite independent of one another. You don't find any of them that are shuffled around. You don't find any sort of verses that are not present or extra verses that are present. By and large, the structure of a surah is fixed by this point in time, with the wording still a little bit fluid. Now, what does, and the surah order, of course, being not fixed. And so, Behnam, he applies the principles of textual criticism to determine, or to show, rather, I think pretty convincingly, that the Sana'a palimpsest, the C1 text type, is not a direct descendant of the Uthmanic text type. So it is not the case that someone took the Uthmanic text type and then, made some changes to it, or they didn't recall things really well and introduced all these variants. That it is sort of they share a common ancestor, is the best way to put it, and that allows one to say things about that common ancestor. Now he identifies the common ancestor as he calls it the prophetic archetype, and what he would say is, well, the mechanism responsible for variation between the palimpsest and between the Uthmanic text type, and also the companion codices, like holistically, how do we explain these variations? The way he explains it is, he says, well, if you look at it, this doesn't look like a case of written transmission. The degree of differences, because we have a whole family of manuscripts, a whole lineage, the whole Uthmanic lineage, and we can compare manuscripts. And the fact of the matter is, all manuscripts that belong to the Uthmanic text type are more or less identical, barring well-known identifiable scribal errors and like little things here and there, right? So and the main difference is spelling. So spelling changes over time, so you have spelling, but the text, like what is being conveyed by this document, by this text, it is basically the same. It has not really changed at all. All right, so it's basic. So we know what written transmission looks like. It looks like that. And the differences between the Uthmanic text type and the other ones is not the same. It's far more like there's a greater degree of variation, but it's also not oral, because we know what oral transmission looks like. We can compare very early versions of, hadith or of sirah, and we see the degree of variation between them. And it's far greater than what we find between the different Quranic text types. It's somewhere in between. So what Behnam calls it, he says it's sort of a hybrid written oral transmission. Now, the model that he proposes is one of dictation. So he suggests that what might have took place is the Prophet might have been dictating Quran, and he had scribes that were writing down material, and they sort of took down the cliff notes. And when they went back home, they filled in the blanks, and they filled it in a little bit different. And because the Quran has rhyme and it has sort of self-similarity, that also sort of govern the degree of variability that emerges. It isn't fully prose. And I think he would sort of propose a mechanism, or he does in his Codex of a Companion, a mechanism somewhat like that. So am I fully on board with that? Maybe, maybe not. I think there are different models that can be proposed to explain, but I think the key pieces of detail are the relationship between the palimpsest and between the Uthmanic text and the companion codices. I would say those are the important pieces. And generally speaking, it's consistent with the general historical narrative that you do find in the Muslim sources. The evidence is consistent in that many companions had codices. There were variations between them, etc. So even though it's not a witness to a specific companion codex, it does sort of fit within that paradigm. Not to say that it doesn't fit in other paradigms, but it is very consistent with that one specifically.
All right. Thank you so much for that. And as we near our conclusion, do you mind telling us a bit about how do we determine the regionality of the codices?
Yeah, so that brings up the question is, what is regionality? And, I published a paper on this recently. So if we go back to, Muslim sources, they all basically unanimously agree that the third Caliph Uthman basically took on a massive project in which he basically standardized the text of the Quran. And then he made copies of that standard text and he sent it out. He sent copies of that text out to different regions, mainly garrison cities, right? So Kufa, Basra, he kept a copy in Medina and he sent one to Syria. And of course, I think it was sent to Hims. And, this is somewhat of a contentious issue, but so the issue with Hims is that, it was primarily a garrison city. It was very important. So Emesa, in sort of the pre-Umayyad time period, its population, I think at some point was greater, or at least Muslim population was greater than that of Damascus. And there were military contingents that were staged out of there. So Hims was a very important city. And so Uthman sent the Mus'haf to one copy to Hims. And, from these all sort of extant surviving Mus'hafs, codices, manuscripts descend. And so Muslim sources document discrepancies, minor variants that were present between these codices, and so each collection of variants that is characteristic of one manuscript allows us to identify or determine its regionality. So we can say, well, this manuscript has Syrian variants, so it's Syrian regionality. This manuscript is Kufan, it's Basran, it's Medinan, things like that. And so in order to do this, of course, so there's a question of how is there a historical reality to these regional codices? And, Noldeke, he kind of made an observation. He said that if you look at the pattern of the reported variants between the codices, they form a stemma. So they form like a family tree. And that's sort of indicative of the fact that it kind of reflects some reality because it's kind of hard to fabricate variants that fit this, that generate, that are consistent with this nice stemma. Michael Cook comes along and he refines a little bit. So Noldeke, he said, I think the Medinan is the archetype, and Cook said, well, hold on a second. We can't be sure based on just the variants alone that it is just that the Medina is the archetype. And there are other issues to do with the Basra Mus'haf. Did they have a certain variant or not? And was Mecca sent a Mus'haf or not? And that has to sort of brings us into schematics. And so I tend to agree with Cook on this and Noldeke in that the variants reported for the Meccan Codex seem to be dependent upon the other codices. And what that means is we can determine. So what I did, sorry to take a step back, is I went through and I said, well, let me go through number one, the literary sources. So Cook and Noldeke, they relied on Al-Muqni'. So I mentioned this book before, Ad-Dani's book, and he basically has a summary in the back of his book of the regional variants. But one important thing to realize is that it's just a summary, and basically no two works have the same exact list. They, depending on who transmits the list and depending on other things, some people might report variants while the other people don't report. And depending on what kind of informants they had access to and what kind of manuscripts they were looking at, you get different lists. And so the question is, well, so what I do is I aggregate all of those variants that are mentioned in the sources, and I distinguish between ones that are reported to be in the reading, the qira'ah of a city, because keep in mind that someone who recites Quran does not have to follow precisely the orthography of the Mus'haf of their sort of regional codex, right? And so one has to be very careful to distinguish between variants that are explicitly reported as being found in writing and ones that are just found in the reading of a certain people or a certain city. In any case, so I aggregate all those variants, and I sort of classify them into well-attested one and the poorly attested ones. And then I go through manuscripts. And what I do is I aggregate all variants without actually distinguishing between them. I just aggregate all of them in the spreadsheet I showed you earlier in our conversation. And then what I do is I apply this technique called phylogenetic analysis. So it's basically, phylogenetics is the study of, ancestry and speciation and evolution. And one can make certain, correspondences and analogies between written transmission and the introduction of mutations and scribal errors with evolution. And by applying that, what I show is that all manuscripts that we have, they all go back to 4 ancestral codices. So it's consistent with the literary sources, and it supports the fact that Uthman copied, let's say, at least 4 codices. We do have reports, ad hoc reports that Uthman sent a mushaf to Mecca, that Uthman sent a mushaf to Bahrain and to Yemen. But the fact of the matter is there's no evidence of them when you look at the variants in the manuscripts. It doesn't mean they didn't exist. It just means that if they existed, they were dependent on the 4 primary codices that were initially copied, if that makes sense. Now, the other interesting thing, and I'll get to how we can identify regionality. The other interesting thing, though, is that by comparing the orthography, the spelling of the variants that are reported in the literary sources with what we find in the manuscripts, we discover something very interesting. We can find discrepancies between spellings in the earliest manuscripts and between the reports. And that allows us to date what time period were the manuscripts that the people who wrote those reports were looking at. I worded that really convoluted. So what we can do is we can figure out the dates, approximately, of course, the dates of the manuscripts that the people who transmitted those reports relied on, right? So we can see, so for example, many people report that manuscripts, so the word fakharaj in Q23, I forgot the verse number, they said that in all manuscripts, that word is spelled plain A, spelled with an alif, fakharaj, alif, jim, right? So, but if you actually look at the earliest manuscripts, almost every single first century manuscript that we have writes it effectively without the alif. And it's around the turn of the century, into the 2nd century, that we start seeing the alif spelling, the plain A spelling pop up. And so we can say that, well, if someone is going to say that every single manuscript I've ever looked at has the alif spelling, well, then that tells us something that they weren't really looking at the earliest manuscripts. They were looking at manuscripts that came from at least the 2nd century, if not later. And then you can do that as well with the regional variants. And what you can figure out is, and what I propose is that knowledge of these regional variants was not known at the time of codification. So when this Uthmanic text type was produced, people didn't realize there were these minor differences between them. But as people interacted, so people traveled from Kufa to Basra to Medina, they realized that the readings were a little bit different. And then they started going through and they were curious and they started comparing the readings. And what they found out, and then they started picking and choosing between these variants. So someone might like, for example, Abu Ja'far, he's an early Medinan reader. He reads هو الذي ينشركم في البر والبحر. In Q10, he reads Yanshurukum, which is a Syrian variant. It's not a Medinan one. And so you can see early on, people start picking and choosing and mixing between these variants. And the way that we would sort of, in a non-judgmental way, we would say that that's contamination. So you're mixing in different text types. And you can also see that in manuscripts. So basically, our earliest manuscripts are almost all purely one regionality, right? They're almost purely Medinan, Syrian, etc. And then by the end of the 1st century, you start seeing these, contaminated manuscripts pop up. And so that's sort of, and of course, one important point to make is that manuscripts are mobile, right? So regionality, I like to think of is in terms of a subtext type. It helps you identify, the genealogy of a manuscript, but it doesn't mean that a manuscript that has Basran regionality was produced in Basra, let alone read in Basra, let alone discovered in Basra, right? Or sort of like rediscovered, in Basra. These manuscripts were mobile, and we have now some were not mobile. So some we can say stayed in one location for a long time. So there's a manuscript, this Codex Damascensis, that I'm working on. Its regionality is Syrian, in fact, and its verse count is Himsi. So actually the variants are Himsi. The verse count is Himsi. the later vocalization with the red dots is also Syrian, if not Himsi. And the manuscript, the provenance of the manuscript is actually the Umayyad mosque. So it actually was in Qubbat al-Khazna, which was this big dome. It was kind of like a geniza where people sort of disposed of religious material, and which was opened up by the Ottomans. And this manuscript, it comes from there. And so I would hypothesize that this manuscript spent most of its life or its entire life in Syria. But that's not the case with everything. So we have things that were recovered in Egypt in the Masjid Amr ibn al-As in Fustat in Old Cairo that has Medinan regionality, right? So and they're very old manuscripts. So that's not necessarily a given. So what I'll do right now is I'll share my screen and I'll go through a little bit of some tables in my paper and show how one can determine regionality on that basis. So let me go here. All right. So, well, the first thing is in my, it's a long paper, but a lot of it's sort of tables and documents. But in the appendix, what I have here is I kind of go through and I document, all the reports that I relied on in my analysis. And I mentioned the work, so Ma'ani al-Quran, Farrat's work, Fadal al-Quran, etc. And I have sort of a critical discussion of the transmission and some of the issues, the concerns I have with the attribution of some of the reports to some early figures. So if someone's interested in that, I think they should give this section a read. I also distinguish between written variants and oral variants, and you can kind of go through this table here and see that. But sort of in a nutshell, if you're interested in determining the regionality of a manuscript, what you can do is you can go to this table in my my paper, table 2. Table 1, this is the poorly attested variants. So you can go to table 1 here, and you can pull up a manuscript and you can look up these locations and you can compare the variants that are found in the manuscript with the variants listed here. Now, it's not, you're not guaranteed to get a manuscript that is purely, one of these. I mentioned that before, and in fact, I do have a table here that I kind of give a summary of the agreement with any specific region. And so you can find that, CPP, and so the Codex Perusiano Petropolitanos, the British Library Mushaf that we looked at, the Fustat Codex, and the Birmingham B, not A, they're all 100% Syrian, but Wettstein 1913 is actually only 73%, and the rest can be accounted for in Basra. So it's not a perfectly Syrian manuscript. And so, of course, you get that with manuscripts all the time. All right, so this is basically how you would go about determining regionality. Is you can rely on the table I give, which is just a little bit more comprehensive, and I was a little bit more critical about the variants that I chose to include here. And you can also go to table 2, and you can look up those. Whoops, I was already at table 2, but you can kind of look up these variants as well in the manuscript and compare them. So that's how I would go about determining the regionality of a manuscript.
Just before we conclude, do you mind telling us about some of the projects that you have that you're currently working on?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned in the beginning, my interest is really in the transmission of the Quran in the earliest period, written and oral. So right now I am working on a couple of projects to do with sort of the oral side of things, so the reading traditions. If anyone who's familiar with the work of Shadi Nasr, he's kind of done a lot of work on the transmission of the qira'at from the period of time of the canonical readers down to sort of us, right? So forward in time. But, there's been very little work on what happened before that. And there are a lot of sort of conjectures and sort of assumptions about what the oral Quran looked like prior to that, prior to the canonical readers. And so what I do is this is where sort of I bring in sort of my mathematical statistical side, and I say we can actually use patterns that that are found among the canonical readers to say something about what the oral Quran looked like prior to their time. So really sort of get a glimpse, a window into what the oral transmission of the Quran looked like basically in the 1st century. So really from around the time of the canonization, so around 650, up until the time of the canonical readers. And I think nobody's really done this before and looked at this. So that's a project I'm working on right now that I'm hoping to finish up soon. I'm also interested, as I mentioned, in radiocarbon dating. So I've been sort of putting together a paper on that. One thing I do talk about, I mentioned, is this idea of long-term storage of parchment and sort of pointing out or laying out, I don't know if I would call it like a guide, but basically proposing a standardized approach that I think everyone in the field should follow when it comes to publishing, reporting on, commenting on, and analyzing and contextualizing radiocarbon dates for a manuscript. And so, and other things to do with that. Hopefully, a couple new dates for some manuscripts as well. So maybe some new datings as well in that. The final thing I'm kind of working on that I want to highlight is, we talked a lot about the palimpsest, and so it turns out there's another manuscript out there that is sort of contains as much. I don't know of any other manuscript that contains as much variation as the palimpsest. So there's a manuscript that has many sort of deviations from the standard arithmetic text type, and I've already sort of produced an edition of this manuscript, and I've completed most of the analysis, and I plan on turning it into a monograph, I think. And the idea is, I think it says a lot about how sort of the mechanics of how written transmission happened. I think it says a lot because of the nature of the variants in it. I think it says a lot about, which are very different from the ones present in the palimpsest and the sonnet palimpsest. It also says a lot about the relationship between the arithmetic text type and the palimpsest. And I think it's going to be a very fascinating and a very important contribution to the field, I hope. So, those are some of the projects I'm working on right now.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for this detailed, very informative episode. I really, really appreciate it. And I'm sure the audience appreciates it as well. And good luck with everything, Doctor. And with that, I'd like to conclude the episode.
All right. Thanks for having me again. I appreciate it.